She knew the law. She was the law. But none of that mattered when a power-hungry police officer stopped her on that deserted road and completely ignored who she was. What seemed like a simple approach turned into a tense and dangerous situation, until fate decided to act. The night was silent, the road was almost empty, lit only by scattered streetlights. The black sedan glided steadily along the right lane. Veronica Caldwell had been driving for almost an hour, her mind still stuck on the confidential briefing she had just left. As the new director of the FBI, long, lonely nights were part of the package, but she never imagined this one would be any different. When the red and blue lights exploded in the rearview mirror, she immediately checked the speedometer. 65, stuck. No infringement, no apparent reason to be stopped. Still, she signaled and pulled over, following the protocol she knew by heart. But something about that approach didn't feel right. She got out of the car with her hands in the air, her FBI badge glinting in the dim light of the deserted road. But to the police officer staring at her, that meant nothing. On the contrary, he mocked, tightened his grip on her wrist, and cornered her as if she were just another suspect. What didn't he know? He was minutes away from being handcuffed in her place. That night, it wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a reflection of a larger problem, one that's tired of being ignored. That's when her instinct spoke louder. Something was wrong, very wrong. Veronica knew this was not a common approach. She wasn't just a driver for him. She was a target. What did she do next? That's what changed everything. Do you want to know how she turned the tide when she was alone, surrounded, and had no chance to ask for help? You won't believe how this story ends. Can you imagine what attitude changed everything? Write in the comments. There are no good options. Ma'am, the second officer repeated, his voice treacherously calm, at odds with the tension that weighed in the air like a storm about to break. Get out of the car, now! Veronica took a deep breath, slowly and calculatedly, as if trying to tame an invisible beast about to attack. The cold night air felt heavier, as if the environment itself was conspiring to heighten the tension. Every beat of his heart was a reminder that every movement needed to be calculated to the millimeter. She had already been in rooms with cartel leaders, sitting at negotiating tables where a misplaced comma or a glance at the wrong moment could cost not only her life, but that of dozens of innocent people. I knew the weight of a pause, the value of a well-chosen word, but now, here, in the shadows of a deserted road and surrounded by armed men, the game was different. There was no contract to be signed, no terms to debate. The rules were volatile, shaped by the tension in the officers' gazes and the subtle click of holstered weapons. Adrenaline pulsed through her veins, but she kept her face impassive. His mind worked quickly, analyzing the police officer's posture, reading each micro-expression, looking for invisible exits where there seemed to be none. At that moment, Veronica knew that being the director of the FBI was not enough. There on the cold, lonely asphalt, she was just another black woman, challenging the misguided power of men who had crossed dangerous lines before, and who, that night, seemed ready to cross yet another. The silence around was almost unbearable. Only the wind carrying dust and leaves broke the suffocating stillness. Her breathing, rhythmic and discreet, was her greatest weapon, a disguise to maintain control, even when everything around seemed to fall apart, because she knew the real battlefield at that moment was psychological, and losing your cool would be giving away victory. With calculated, almost choreographed movements, Veronica slid her hand to the car's handle, her fingers firm but controlled, as if she were about to pull back the curtain on a stage where the next scene could be fatal. The other hand remained raised, visible, illuminated by the trembling, bluish light of the vehicle, which cast long, distorted shadows around it. Kearns, the officer in front of him, took a short step back, just enough to make room for him to exit, but without losing his sense of dominance. His gaze was sharp, predatory, like a hunter who already saw himself in control of his prey. Veronica felt the weight of that gaze as each second dragged on, heavy and tense. When he touched the asphalt, he felt the rough texture under his shoes, and the sharp early morning wind tearing the thin fibers of his blazer, chilling his skin in a way that went beyond the physical. It was the cold of instinct, of the sharp intuition that warned imminent danger. It wasn't the wind of the night, it was the wind of vulnerability. Kearns quickly repositioned himself, his broad, imposing body assuming a stance almost calculated to block the squad car's line of sight. It was a physical and symbolic barrier. He didn't just want to prevent the recording, he wanted to isolate Veronica from any possibility of witnesses or concrete evidence. The second, quieter police officer was positioned just behind, filling the space with a suffocating presence. It closed the siege, leaving it without clear escape routes. Veronica noticed the details, his hand close to his holster, his restless gaze, as if awaiting a non-verbal command. They were lined up. That wasn't a mistake in approach. It was a well-rehearsed script. The silence around him was almost a separate character, heavy and oppressive, amplified by the distant sound of leaves being dragged by the breeze and the occasional rustling of nearby trees. The empty road seemed an involuntary accomplice to that dark theater. Veronica was not naive. I knew I had seen this scenario before, in dossiers, in archived videos, in reports stained with pain. But now it was inside him. A game that for many ended without witnesses. And yet she stood tall, because Veronica wasn't just the director of the FBI. She was a woman who carried on her shoulders every story that had ended badly on nights like that. And she wouldn't allow that one to add to the statistics. "Turn around," ordered Kearns, his voice icy and filled with the arrogance of someone who was already playing according to a dark and repeated script. There was something about the way he spoke that made it clear this wasn't the first time. Veronica remained firm. His heart was hammering against his ribcage, but his expression was a mask of absolute control, the result of years of dealing with extreme situations. She looked directly into his eyes, calculating every nuance of their silent exchange. "I still haven't been told why I'm being detained," she said, with a calm tone, but full of veiled defiance. Kearns smiled, but the smile was venomous, a grimace of someone who despises the word justice. The corner of his mouth lifted in mockery. "Suspicious behavior," he responded, as if in a rehearsal, oblivious to the gravity of his own statement. Veronica held his gaze. "What behavior exactly?" he insisted, his voice as controlled as a sharp blade being drawn at the right moment. He shook his head, almost impatiently, like someone who has had enough of a game, whose outcome he believes is predictable. "Refusal to obey," he said, and there was the empty justification that she already knew well. The trap closed around her like the jaws of a predator. It was the playbook for abuse, creating the perfect scenario for escalating force. Veronica knew this, knew every line of that dirty manual. To resist would give Kearns and his partner the excuse they craved to deliver the final blow. But giving in would mean accepting the role they were trying to impose on him. The dilemma was suffocating, and before he could decide his next move, Kearns took the next step and crossed the line. His hand, cold and rough, grabbed Veronica's wrist with a brutality that made his intention clear: to show control. "Let go of me," she snapped, her voice low but sharp like broken glass in the silent night. It was an order, not a request. But he didn't let go. The grip tightened, the thumb pressing almost deliberately over the nerve in the wrist, while Kearns' partner, just a few steps away, already had one hand on the radio, eyes scanning the darkness as if searching for witnesses. "We have an uncooperative suspicion," he said, his voice slurred and devoid of any empathy, as if he were describing something routine. And it was. For them, It was routine to turn lives into cold statistics, and it was, at that moment, as if something had disrupted a fragile balance, that Kearns drew his gun. The metallic sound of the gun leaving its holster seemed to echo louder than it should have, reverberating in the silent night. The icy black barrel stopped just inches from Veronica's face, and time warped. It was as if the world had plunged into a state of suspension where everything around was moving in slow motion. She had already looked into the eyes of unscrupulous criminals. She had already been face to face with drug traffickers armed to the teeth. She had already been through war scenes. But this was different. There, isolated on a road with no witnesses, at least until that moment, Veronica was facing the true face of poorly exercised power, someone with a uniform and an ego inflated by the certainty of impunity. His body remained motionless, but inside, alarms were ringing in unison. His muscles were tense to the maximum, ready to act. But his trained mind knew that the slightest movement could be interpreted as a threat. "Do you feel powerful now?" spat Kearns with a tone full of venom and disdain, tilting her head slightly as if amused by the idea of having an FBI director at gunpoint. But he didn't see what moved Veronica at that moment. It wasn't fear, it was contained fury, the anger of accumulated years, of dossiers closed without punishment, of victims silenced before they had a voice. She carried not only her own safety, and but the weight of the stories of so many others. She was about to respond, the words already sharp in her mind, when something unexpected broke through the dense, tense air of that forgotten road. "Hey, I'm recording everything!" shouted a firm voice, cutting through the silence of the night like a blade. The scream echoed across the deserted road, coming from the darkness on the other side of the road. Kearns hesitated. It was a fleeting moment, but enough to break the brutal rhythm he imposed. His finger loosened slightly on the trigger, and his gaze, which until then had been fixed on Veronica, shifted unsteadily to the source of the interruption. Veronica, sensing the gap, turned her head slightly and followed the sound. The darkness of the road was cut only by the dim lighting of the car's headlights and the cold glow of a cell phone screen. There, on the sidelines, a man, young in a shabby coat and thick-rimmed glasses, held the phone steady in front of his face. The blue reflection of the screen highlighted his tense but determined features. "Are you sure you want to continue with this, officer?" challenged the civilian without changing his tone, but making it clear that he would not back down. There was an unusual strength in his voice, the conviction of someone who knew the weight of his presence there at that very moment. Kearns' partner took an uncertain step, torn between the instinct to protect his colleague and the growing fear of being immortalized in the lens of that camera. His hand hovered near the side of the gun, but he didn't dare touch it. Veronica noticed the invisible crack that appeared between them. The theater of power, until then masterfully rehearsed, began to collapse under the weight of sudden surveillance and the fear of being exposed. And then, in the distance, the distinct sound of sirens cut through the night, first as a distant whisper, then growing, taking shape, like the inevitable announcement that the board had just changed. Veronica felt the tide turning. She squared her shoulders, and her voice sounded firm, like tempered steel. "Drop the weapon," he ordered, each word carrying the weight of his authority and the moment. Kearns held the pistol raised, but the tension in his veins was no longer one of pure confidence. The tip of the weapon shook slightly, betraying the crack in his posture. Today, sirens were approaching fast. The game of blue and red lights began to lick the asphalt, reflecting in the dark puddles and in the eyes of the civilian, who remained motionless, filming every second. Kearns gritted his teeth. "Get him out of there," he said, trying to maintain control, But the tone was no longer the same. There was more desperation than command. Veronica moved forward, closing the distance with surgical precision. His eyes were a living warning. "Hold him and I'll put you in jail for obstruction of justice," he declared, his voice serious, with no room for negotiation. The impact was immediate. Kern's partner froze, fingers slowly moving away from the holster. The threat of public exposure was more effective than any weapon at that moment. The sirens were upon them now. The sound pulsed, vibrating in the freezing air. The dance of lights was reflected in the lens of the man's cell phone and in the sweat that was now dripping down Kern's temple. Veronica recognized that look. I had seen it before, in cornered criminals, in corrupt agents discovered. It was the look of someone who realizes that the ground beneath their feet is collapsing. Absolute control of the situation had evaporated. The weight of the camera and sirens was unbearable even for someone like Kearns, and in that instant Veronica knew they had lost. And then, like a fuse that shatters the tense silence, the vehicles arrived at high speed, their lights cutting through the darkness of the night with blinding intensity. The deafening sound of sirens echoed down the road, announcing the arrival of more reinforcements. The doors of the vehicles opened with a metallic clang, and armed police officers, with impassive expressions and hands firmly positioned on their weapons, jumped onto the asphalt with military precision, ready for whatever was necessary. The chaos seemed to stagnate for a brief moment, as if time had distorted, frozen, awaiting the decisive movement that would seal the fate of that night. The air was thick, charged with palpable tension. Every breath was a held sigh. Every look between the officers was an unspoken code, filled with distrust and expectation. The weight of the decision hung over everyone, like a dragging shadow, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself. Hands were close to guns, but no one had drawn them yet. The suspense was in every tense finger, in every minimal movement, as if everyone was waiting for something they didn't know if it would be necessary, but that could be the only answer. There was a doubt in the air, an almost palpable hesitation, that only those who had already crossed the dangerous lines of authority and violence could recognize. It was the uncertainty of a turning point, the point of no return, where the weight of the final choice became overwhelming. They were all on the edge of a precipice, and it was exactly at that moment, when silence threatened to engulf the situation, that the doubt was broken with a word, spoken with the clarity of an irrevocable decree. "Director Caldwell." The sentence cut the air with the precision of a blade. The tone was calm, almost casual, but the reaction was immediate. Kearns, who until then had stood like a wall of arrogance and power, shuddered. The partner next to him flinched slightly, eyes wide with the sudden realization that he was standing before a figure that would not be intimidated as easily as other people. The lieutenant, who until then had observed everything in silence, had already grasped the gravity of the situation and the weight of recognition. Veronica felt the turn. The fact of being recognized was not just a question of status or power. It was the outburst of a truth that no one could ignore anymore. The layer of impunity that surrounded Kearns and his partner began to crumble, piece by piece, before everyone's eyes. The word director was not just a title, but the key that opened the doors of justice, of truth. And, like an avalanche, the consequences of this revelation began to unfold. The tension that had been hovering, thick and crushing, began to be replaced by an electric expectation. There was no more room for doubts or hesitations. The game had changed, and now it was a question of how it would all end. What seemed to be a simple clash of power now became a public spectacle of justice, where everyone was about to witness the fall of those who believed that impunity was their only ally. The name came out of the lieutenant's mouth like an arrow, fast accurate, piercing the heavy atmosphere of tension that had formed around him. The scene, which until then seemed ready to explode at any moment, froze for a second that dragged on like an eternity. The weight of the word Director Caldwell spread through the air like an inescapable sentence, a hallmark of authority. Kearns barely reacted, but his body tensed slightly, his jaw clenched, as if he were trying to hold back the fury rising in his throat. His partner, who until then seemed safe, immediately turned pale, the blood disappearing from his face, leaving impaler than the asphalt itself. It was as if the revelation of who she was had erased any remaining shred of trust. The lieutenant, with his insignia shining under the red and blue lights of the vehicles, captured every detail in a matter of seconds. His eyes quickly scanned the scene. Veronica with her hands raised, an immaculate posture, not one of submission but of firm command. Kearns, with the gun low but still firmly gripped, and his partner paralyzed, undecided whether to advance or retreat, their nerves visibly frayed. It was no longer a simple case of a police stop. It was a battle of power, where the rules were about to be rewritten. And then, in the distance, the civilian with the cell phone in his hand, his posture unshakable, as if he knew that the moment he found himself in would be crucial. The cell phone screen shone against the darkness of the night, and each movement of the camera recorded, with surgical precision, the details of that confrontation. He knew that when he pressed the record button, he became a witness to what could be the turning point of a much larger story. Veronica, with a calculated look, realized the impact of the lieutenant's words. She took advantage of the golden chance that appeared before her. With gentle but firm movements, she lowered her hands slowly, but not like someone who surrendered. It was a gesture of leadership, a clear and unquestionable command, like a general giving orders on the battlefield. Lieutenant detained these two. Now, the sentence came out with the authority of someone in control, with no room for hesitation or doubt. It was an order that did not admit interpretations, a sentence that would leave no room for resistance. Her voice, deep and firm, cut the air, with the clarity of a knife cut, making it clear that the game had now changed, and she was the one commanding the pieces. The second officer, who until then had seemed to absorb the chaos around him with a mixture of fear and confusion, took a step back, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Wait, that's not—" He started to protest, his voice shaking, but Veronica didn't give him room to continue. She knew that hesitation in that situation could be fatal. "Not another word," she cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. The authority in his words made the air seem thicker, and the second officer, now completely disoriented, faltered even more, not knowing whether he was on the right or wrong side of the line drawn before him. It was a turning point, and no one, not even Kearns and his partner, could any longer ignore the weight of the rapidly approaching consequences. The siege was in place, and the time of uncertainty had passed. "Not another word," Veronica cut in, her voice as cold as the night wind, as if she had already seen that film before. Her gaze fixed on Kearns, and then she turned slightly to the civilian, making an almost imperceptible gesture with her chin, but enough to indicate him. The man's cell phone, with its screen shining under the red and blue lights of the police cars, now seemed to weigh a ton, as if that small device was capable of collapsing everything around it. Every click of the camera, every second recorded, transformed the situation into something much bigger than anyone there could control. The lieutenant, who had already experienced and witnessed crisis situations in his career, looked from Veronica to Kearns and then to his partner, who was clearly panicking, his eyes glazed over, as if he saw the end of his career before him. The man wouldn't need anything else to realize what was at stake. He was experienced enough to understand that this wasn't just a poorly handled approach. It was a bomb waiting to explode in both the media and public opinion. He knew that once the story was recorded and began to circulate, the situation would take turns that none of them could have predicted. Kearns, for his part, was far from immune to the mounting pressure. He felt the weight of guilt and tension, his breathing heavy and ragged, hatred pulsing in his eyes, but an anger that at that moment was almost impotent. Every muscle in his body seemed to vibrate with the frustration of no longer being in control of the situation. Slowly, with an almost mechanical movement, he lowered the weapon, but his posture still showed a hint of arrogance. The mere fact that he had given in left the anger still bubbling beneath the surface, as if he was forcing himself to swallow the poison of defeat. "It was a misunderstanding," Kearns muttered, his voice hoarse, trying to coat his words with an excuse that sounded more like a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Of course, he knew no one would believe his side of the story, but still he had to try, one last effort to regain some of the control that was slipping through his fingers. Veronica didn't hide the contempt that formed in her eyes. There was no more room for justifications. She already knew what had happened, and more importantly, she knew how the story would be told. His response was dry, emotionless. "Great. Let's clarify this at headquarters, with the Internal Affairs Department and the prosecutor at our side." His words were like a well-aimed blow, sealing the fate of Kearns and his partner. There would be no more room for excuses or manipulations. Justice would finally be served. Kearns's partner, visibly cornered and already taking a step away from the scene, swallowed hard. His eyes were panicked. He knew there was no way back from the situation and that he was about to pay for his inaction. His body was tense, as if the adrenaline had already worn off, and the reality of what was happening was beginning to take root in his mind. The lieutenant, exhausted, sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the situation that was unfolding. He knew there was no going back. Without further ado, and with the resignation of someone who recognizes that there is no more room for hesitation, he gave the verdict that everyone already knew was inevitable. "Handcuff you too," he ordered, his voice firm but tinged with the weight of responsibility that fell on his shoulders. There was no longer any way to deny what had happened that night. The game was over, and the truth was about to be exposed. "Handcuff them both." The sound of the order was dry, clear, and so authoritative that it seemed to cut the air around it, like a knife blow in the midst of the silence that had begun. It was a final, unequivocal decision, which left no room for questioning or attempts at manipulation. There was no longer any way out for Kearns or his partner. Their fate was sealed, and the weight of order was as present as the flashing lights of the police cars in the background. Kearns, completely stunned and surprised by the suddenness of the turnaround, exploded. "You've got to be kidding!" Disbelief brimmed in his voice, a mixture of anger and despair. It was the cry of someone who, until that moment, had always believed he was above the rules. Someone who felt untouchable, but now, faced with that relentless authority, he saw his own life crumble, piece by piece, and the knowledge that he no longer had control made him completely lose his composure. The tone of his voice, hysterical and defiant, resonated like a last attempt to recover something that no longer existed: control of the situation. Veronica, however, was unshakable. She knew she could not give in to pressure or violence disguised as indignation. She remained calm, her body firm and her expression imperturbable, showing no signs that the situation was affecting her. She took a step forward, maintaining her posture of authority. His words came out with the precision of a sharp blade, emotionless but loaded with the weight of justice. "You pulled a gun on the director of the FBI, Officer Kearns. Do you really want to add resisting arrest to the list?" His voice cut through, the air like a war command, with no room for excuses or manipulations. She wasn't just making a statement, she was definitively taking control of the situation. Kearns, who until then maintained the posture of someone holding the reins in his hands, seemed to collapse under the force of Veronica's words. His gaze, until then firm and defiant, wavered. He lay still for a moment as if trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time that night, and perhaps for the first time in a long time, she saw real fear dawn in Kearns' eyes. It wasn't the superficial fear he had tried to hide with his bravado, but the genuine fear of someone who knows the game is over, that everything he's done up to this point is now being used against him. He took a step back, trying to regain some of the lost control, but it was clear that shame and panic were taking over. Veronica's strength, her silent and relentless determination, disarmed him so much that he didn't know how to react. For the first time, he was in the submissive's place, and it left him powerless. The arrogant smile he used to hide his own insecurity crumbled before the strength of a woman who was fearless, a woman who knew exactly what to do when the rules were broken. For years, Veronica had seen situations like this end in impunity, always almost. But not this time. When the handcuffs closed on Kearns, the metallic sound seemed to seal something bigger, the beginning of a reckoning. The partner, defeated, just lowered his head as he was handcuffed. "Director, are you okay?" asked the lieutenant, trying to maintain a formal tone. "Just get them out of my sight," he replied, cold as the night around him. But she knew. That was just the first step. It wasn't about two men with badges. It was about an entire system that had failed for too long. And now she had something that few in that position could achieve, proof. As the two were escorted to their squad cars, Kearns still seemed to harbor the illusion that he would escape unharmed. Men like him always believe it until the ground disappears beneath their feet. Veronica took a deep breath, searching within herself for the strength she always kept hidden. The civilian approached, cell phone still recording, but with a worried look. "He is well?" She nodded with a slight tired smile. "Thanks to you." "They do it straight away, just not with people like you," he replied, the words hanging heavy in the air. Veronica felt the impact of the sentence. It was the naked truth. It was not an isolated case. It was a cycle. Until someone broke, more vehicles arrived. Some officers exchanged indignant looks, others just watched in silence. But everyone knew that the night would not end there. The lieutenant approached. Again. "Will you want to press charges in person?" Veronica looked straight into his eyes. "It's not personal, it's systemic." The lieutenant's silence was response enough. He understood. Everyone there understood. "I want the complete records of both. Of them. No filters, no omissions." The man hesitated. "This may take a while, Director. If you think I'm going to let this go, you're underestimating the wrong person." He just nodded, resigned. Veronica knew this wasn't just an unusual night. It was a chance to expose what many already knew, but few were able to prove. Hours later, the recording went viral. In the morning, it was all over the news, social media, debate tables. Before noon, the Justice Department had opened a formal investigation. Kearns was removed and charged. The partner, suspended. The department issued an icy, bureaucratic note, but the damage had already been done. Veronica, alone in her room, watched, everything in silence. The phone vibrated non-stop. Calls from reporters, from politicians wanting to control the narrative, from colleagues offering support or asking difficult questions. But she had already decided. She was not going to back down. The cell phone vibrated. Again, unknown number. For a second he thought about ignoring it, but he answered, "Director Caldwell." There was a pause, and then the familiar civilian voice. "I just wanted to say, I admire what you did. Most people wouldn't do it. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Most people don't have the power I have. The silence on the other side was filled with the gravity of the statement, and then she added in a low tone, "But I do." For the first time in a long time, Veronica felt something rare, almost forgotten: hope. Justice does not happen in silence. It is only born when someone refuses to look the other way. So pay attention. If this story moved you, talk about it. Share. Scream if you have to, because the truth only lives when no one remains silent.